Hello everyone and welcome to my very first tutorial, namely my wig thickening tutorial. First of all, it's important for me to say that I'm not an expert and this may not be the best or only way to redo a wig. But here I explain how I sew wig wefts to make my wigs look bigger. Hopefully this will help some of you who are also just starting out with wig makeovers. Enjoy and feel free to give feedback. First of all, I will show you the wig which I will rework in this tutorial. As I'm only a student, I often don't have a lot of money for cosplay, so I buy cheaper wigs that I redo. I bought this wig for my Max Caulfield cosplay. Originally it was long and wavy. Before this tutorial I had already straightened and shortened it, but after that the wig was too thin for me, so I decided to thicken it with the cut strands. To do this, you will first need the strands you have cut off or bought separately for your wig. If they are very different lengths, it's best to divide them so you can know which strand you will use higher up, lower down, or for the fringe. Next, you will need pins to attach your wefts to the wig and scissors to cut the tulle. For the tulle, choose a fabric that's similar color to your wig and not too big grained. Also, use a tape measure to measure how long your wefts need to be. That's it! The first thing to do is to measure what length our wefts need. To do this, clip up the hair and find a bald spot where we want to add a weft later. Make sure that you have exposed the entire length of the weft. I then normally pin it with a needle just to don't get rid of the end or of the beginning of my weft. Once you have done this, put your tape measure from the beginning to the end and note the length you need. It's always better to add 1 or 2 centimeters so that you don't end up with way too less. Now you need this measurement to cut your tulle. Take this as the length and about 5 centimeters as the width. It doesn't matter if the cuts are not 100% straight, most of it will be cut off later anyway. Now comes the most difficult part of the tutorial, which is sewing the individual strands to the tulle. First, clamp your strip of tulle slightly over the half of the width under the presser foot. Before you start sewing, set your sewing machine to straight stitch with a short length. When everything is ready, take a strand and prepare it for sewing. To do this, press at a point that is relatively far out, and with the other hand keep going down and pulling. This will allow you to grab loose strands and pinch them under your first hand. You won't be able to sew all the strands in place, but with this technique you can minimize loose strands before sewing. Now we take the strand and place it on the already combed tulle. Think about how you want your weft to look beforehand. Are you mainly interested in density at the roots? Do you have a short wig? Or do you also want to have more fullness in the length? For longer strands and density at the roots, put the strand in as follows. The desired length of hair goes on the left side and a shorter but longer than 5 cm length of hair on the right side. If this side is too short, the hair at the roots may stick out strangely and you won't get a good transition. In my examples, I only use this technique. However, if you are dealing with the lower wefts, shorter wigs, or if you do not want a higher density directly at the roots, you can insert the hair as follows. There should be approximately the same distance to the right and the left. So, put your strands in the way you prefer. You will make 2 stitches next to each other in the middle. So remember that the part of your strand where the weft is bent will be to the left of your first seam. It sounds more complicated than it is. Just watch me place my strand and sew it in place. Always place the strands one after the other. Sew them in place and then the next. Do not place too many strands at once, as they will probably not all be sewn down and it will be more difficult to fold them over. In my example, I used a lot of hair. Normally this is already a bit too much, but if you try out the first strands beforehand to see how thick the hair is and whether it can be bent well after it has been sewn so thickly, it is also no problem. Otherwise, it's usually better to be on the safe side and to sew thinner but more wefts. After you've finished the first seam, take out the tulle and put it back exactly as before. Be careful because the strands are not sewn in yet. The tulle should be inserted so that you can sew a second seam about half to 1 centimeter to the left of the first seam. In this picture you can see the black, which is the first seam, and the green, the one we now want to do. Don't sew too quickly and use your hands to place the strands so that they are sewn on straight. Otherwise, you may end up with really weird textures. Now comes the part that gets difficult if you've taken too much hair at once. In this part, we fold the tulle exactly in the middle between the two seams. This can be quite complicated at the beginning, but after some practice, it's not so bad. You can use sewing clips or needles to pin the weft and then sew it, but for me it works better to fold the strand directly while sewing. Fix the folded strand under the foot and then take care of the sewing machine settings, because now we need a small zigzag stitch. The stitch width should be around 1 and the stitch length should be set a little smaller than before, so again between 0 and 1. With the zigzag stitch we can fix the hair a little better than with the straight stitch, and after folding, the hairs are also less likely to slip individually. To make folding a little easier, place the side with the shorter hair on top. Again, make sure that the hair goes into the seam as it comes out of the other seam. Simply put, the strands must be straight. The thicker the strand, the more likely it is to slip, so you have to be very careful while sewing. As you may see, I sew directly on the first seams. The smaller the distance to the fold, the neater the weft. The hair should now be well fixed. If you are not sure, you can go over it a second time. After that, it's time to cut off the extra tulle, and now it becomes obvious why it doesn't matter if it's cut crooked, because now we cut the tulle right at the seam. Don't be too fast here either, otherwise you run the risk of cutting off hair too. I like to take the weft afterwards, fold it, and go through it again with my hand. This way I can grab the majority of the loose strands and put them back on the strand pile. As a very last measure on the weft, I lay it flat on the table and I brush it. This gives it a nicer texture and the last loose hairs are taken away by the brush. We have now finished the weft. The next step is to attach it to a wig, of course. The wig is still attached to the head with the bald spot visible, and we now pin the new weft to this exact spot. Since I did that wrong quite a lot of times, make sure you attach the weft to the wig cap and not to the head. Now it comes back to a question of preference. I prefer to sew all the wefts first and pin them on, so that I can see if the wefts fit properly and achieve the desired effect before sewing. Of course, you can also sew the wefts to the wig directly after sewing them, but I would recommend the other option more, as it avoids having to cut out unwanted wefts later. Now, when it comes to sewing on the wefts, I would recommend that if you do as I do, start sewing on the bottom wefts. The higher the wefts are on the wig, the more hair you have to push aside to be able to sew properly, so make it easier on yourself and start sewing at the bottom. Here you can see how I started with the lower part of the fringe. Put the overlying hairs over the weft you just sewed on and find the next loose weft you created. And so you continue until you're done. Make sure that you do not sew the elastic bands to secure the wig to the cap. If the wig cap is of not too good quality, it may well be that it consists only of loose elastics at the top. Here you must be careful not to sew the wefts too tightly, because otherwise the wig can become quite tight. It is best to always use the adjustment wefts as a guide. Take care to cut off the ends of the threads. Since I always forget to do this while sewing, I did it afterwards. When all your wefts are sewn on, your wig will still look pretty messy, so place them back on the wig head and brush it neatly. Don't be surprised that some hair will still come off in the process. This shouldn't be a big deal in most cases. Congratulations! We have been able to thicken our wig. For comparison, here's another before and after picture after I cut the wig again. You can clearly see the difference. And this is the wig after I finished it. I hope you enjoyed my tutorial and that it helps you revise your own wigs. Feel free to leave me your feedback. See ya!